1815, Napoleon returns. If that's how you say it, it could also be Napoleon returns, 1815. Or actually, strictly speaking, Napoleon, 1815 returns. It's a game about deja vu. No, actually, it is a game about 1815 and the return of Napoleon. Because of the way the map looks and of some other elements, such as the topic, the game is somewhat reminiscent of the classic game Napoleon, the Waterloo Campaign, but in truth, it works quite differently. It is a war game for 2 or more players. 2 is the minimum. And you can split the forces among more players than 2. And yes, you heard that right. 2 is the minimum. I can play almost every war game solitaire, even almost every non-war game solitaire by controlling both forces to the best of my possibilities. Not this one. This one really, secret information is vital for the game to make sense. And so you cannot play solitaire. The game takes place on this mounted map here. As you can see, there aren't many units on the board. Units are represented by these wooden blocks with an indication of the force that the block represents. The overall look of the map is just so nice because it looks like a military map. And again, if you know the classic game, the Waterloo Campaign, again, the map kind of looks that way. Each block represents a specific group for the Allies, for the Prussians, or of course for the French. Each group also is connected to a player aid that holds some important information. So for each group on the map, say First Corps, Second Corps, Reserve, Cavalry, and so on and so forth, you have a track here that tells you the tactical rating. We'll see what that means. The number of cards that group produces in combat, the number of cohesion points the group has at the beginning of the game, and each time the group takes a hit, you reduce that by 1 by moving that cube. There is a number of reduced cards that the group produces in combat when it loses a certain number of points. So if the First Corps goes from 6 to 5 points, then it only produces 2 cards in combat instead of 3. Then we have commanders. They also have their own block. They don't have cohesion points because they can never be damaged in combat, but they also has a tactical rating that you can use in combat where the leader is, and again, they produce a number of cards. Back to the map, it is a point-to-point map, and we're going to move our blocks, our units from location to location. Now, what are we trying to do here? There are 5 objectives cards that are for the French player. These are shuffled, and 2 of them are assigned randomly to the French player at the beginning of the game. You can also play a variant in which the French player chooses their objectives. 4 of these objectives involve taking control of locations on the map, and I marked those locations using yellow cubes. I wish they were already marked on the board, like looking a little bit different, but they don't. So 4 of the possible objectives involve taking control of those locations, so sitting in that location at the end of the turn, or having been the last player to be in that location. 1 involves destroying 3 of the 8 enemy corps. Again, the French player receives 2 of these at the beginning of the game, but these are secret. And this is what the game is all about. This is what makes or breaks the game. If the ally player knew what these were, then the ally player would just put all of their defenses in one of those locations, and the game would just be silly. The entire idea of trying to trick the ally player into splitting forces, and the French player is being tricky that way, and then converges and concentrates forces where the objectives really are, is what the game is about. And again, this is why the game is impossible, in my opinion, to play solitaire. So the French player will win by showing at the end of any turn that they completed their 2 objectives. Also by destroying 4 enemy corps in case this card is not one of the objectives. The Allied player wins by destroying 4 French corps or by simply surviving till the end of last turn, which is turn 15. If the French player has not completed their 2 objectives by the end of turn 15, then the Allied player wins. Each turn, we'll start by rolling a die and checking the weather. 1 to 5, the weather is clear. 6, the weather is rain. You mark that on a little box on the board. And simply during rain, there is less movement that will take place. Then each player rolls dice to determine the number of movement points that they receive. Each group, French, Allied, and Prussian, has a track like this one with a base number of movement points that you always receive, and then based on that movement die roll, you will modify that. So with a 4, the French player actually receives a total of 6 movement points instead of the base 5. And during rain, there is a penalty for that. And again, the Allied player has 2 separate movement point tracks, one for the Prussians and one for the Allies. So everybody determines their number of movement points. Then the French player goes first, and they start spending movement points. A infantry corps moves by 1 location, spending a movement point. You can also force march them by spending an extra movement point, moving an extra location, and reducing that infantry group by 1 cohesion point. Cavalry spends a single movement point to move up to 2 locations. Groups have to stop when they enter an enemy location. Leaders can move up to 2 locations for free. They don't spend movement points, but they do have to end their movement in a location with a friendly unit. And so this is pretty much what happens there for movement. After the French player has completed their movement, then you resolve battle in all locations that contain units of both sides. Then the Allied player will do the same. That is, they will spend their movement points, they will resolve battle, and you continue like that turn after turn until one of the player has completed the objectives. Basically, until a player has won the game. Combat. Combat is card-based, using this deck of cards. As you can see, they represent different maneuvers. Infantry assault, cavalry charge, combined arms. There is a grand battery, there's the grand battery, skirmish, counterattack, etc., etc. Now, some cards simply have the name of the kind of attack that you're using, and some other ones have other effects. At the beginning of combat, each player receives a number of cards produced by the forces that they have in the confrontation. Remember the player that I showed you, each group produces a number of cards. Say, for example, the French cavalry produces 3 cards, so at the beginning of combat the French player receives those 3 cards. Napoleon produces also 3 cards, and so in that combat there, the French player has 6 cards. The Prussian First Corps produces 3, there is no one else there, and so the Prussians only receive 3 cards. The attacker is the player, of course, that moved there and triggered the confrontation. The attacker goes first. The attacker looks at their cards and plays 1. The job of the defender now is to match those cards. If the defender has a card that matches, they simply play it. And for now, that attack is being stopped. What happens next? That the defender now has a chance of becoming the attacker. Very important, because the attacker is the one that actually will inflict damage on the opponent. After matching those cards, the defender may try to become the attacker by rolling a die and rolling equal to or lower than the best tactical rating that they have in combat. Remember, tactical rating that the groups have and that the military commander has. And so, for example, the First Corps has a tactical rating of 2. If the Prussian First Corps, if the Prussian player wants to become the attacker, they roll the die, and on a 1 or a 2, now they become the attacker, And now they choose the card that they play, and the opponent is trying to match. Oh, now the French player has stopped that attack, and now the French player rolls to try to become the attacker. So the role of attacker and defender is determined at the beginning of the game, of the combat, by who went there, but it can switch during the battle itself. This continues until a player cannot or chooses not to match an attack of the attacker, so the defender cannot match the attacker, or the attacker has been unmatched but has no cards to play. So basically, when you cannot play a card because you don't have a match or you don't have any cards, you are the player that lost the battle, and at that point, that player loses a number of cohesion points from their involved units equal to the number of rounds that the confrontation lasted. The longer the battle, the more points are lost. So, for example, in our example, we had a grand battery, an infantry assault, I seem to remember, and a skirmish. Suppose the defender cannot match the skirmish. That was 3 rounds of combat. Now the defender loses 3 cohesion points from their involved forces and also must retreat. Other things, if during the battle you have friendly forces that are adjacent one location away from the confrontation, then each round you can also roll a die, and if you roll equal to or lower than the tactical rating of one of those units in an adjacent location that you want to bring there, you actually do manage to add them to the confrontation, and you receive the corresponding cards produced by that. And this, my friends, is how you play Napoleon 1815. Napoleon 1815 Returns, the Great Deja Vu, or 1815 Napoleon Returns. To me, that's the way it sounds better. Continue like this, turn after turn, maneuvering around, using your movement points, and continue like this until one of the players has completed the objectives that have been set up at the beginning of the game. This game is remarkable. To me, it is quite an accomplishment, and I'll be bold. This may become a modern classic, maybe like the game that this one looks like, although I cannot really say that the Waterloo Campaign is a predecessor. Too many things are different. But maybe this will become a modern classic the way that game that looks like this one has become a modern classic. This is a remarkable game. Now, the biggest negative, since most wargaming happens in solitaire, is that this one cannot be played solitary. It makes no sense if you, as the ally player, know what the objectives of the other side are. You're gonna sit on one of them with all of your forces, and the game absolutely becomes stupid. Nothing makes sense in this game if the ally player knows for sure the objectives. Towards the end of the game, you may figure it out, but that's precisely the point, that you figured it out in turn 13 instead of turn 3. Or maybe it was in turn 10 that you're absolutely sure of what those objectives are, but will you be able at that point to bring people from one side of the map to the other to prevent the French player? So that tension, that uncertainty is what the game is about, what the game relies on. So you need a partner, so less flexibility than games that you can play by yourself or with a human opponent. However, the game is so simple that it becomes easier to find a partner if you have some kids roaming around the house, being bored because of the quarantine. I played this game with my daughter Louisa. True, we also call her the littlest general because she always had some propensity for military things and for things of human interactions as major charges preceded by artillery bombardment. But other than that, so my daughter Louisa likes military stuff, but she's 8, and so a passionate 8-year-old can play this game, and she has been my human opponent, and she was able to play the game perfectly proficiently. She likes to be the French player because in general she likes to be on the attack. Surprise, surprise, shocker, shocker. And she doesn't like the fact that you may win just by not losing. No, she has to win by winning. So that's perfectly fine. I play the allies, she plays the the French player, and she can be sneakier than at sometimes I like it to be as a fighter and as a wargame opponent. She has really figured out that the point is to split your forces, to threaten multiple objectives, and then to be able to converge, or simply to have this one unit that runs across and complete the objectives. The overall architecture and even the overall strategy is simple enough that an 8-year-old can figure it out or can understand it. But then in implementing it, that is where the fun is. And a 44-year-old playing against an 8-year-old can still have fun. Definitely it's not like, okay, I was sitting there with my kid, it was fun to play a family game. This is a bona fide solid war game, which is simple enough that an 8-year-old can play it, simple enough that it can be an intro war game, it can be the first war game that you ever played. Everything is intuitive, everything makes sense, and yet it's so much fun. And yet there are so many subtleties. Again, it's about the maneuvering, it's about the cat and mouse, it's about the bluffing. The combat system, I like it. I'm still not entirely sold in the sense that, I don't know, can't we just resolve it with a die roll? It's nice to have the back and forth. It can be a little tedious to have to put together these large hands of cards. And again, I'm not entirely sold on the fact that it really, the card play, the order, matters all that much. I guess there are ways in which you're trying to get the opponent to play and consume certain cards. I want to retain the initiative for as long as possible. So if you play a certain card, the combined arms that are sort of like the wild card. So I assume if you play the combined arm, which is valuable as a response to my infantry charge, then you don't have other infantry charges. There are these things that you can do. When you play the cavalry charges, the effect is if you win with an unmatched cavalry charge, you inflict 1 extra point of damage. And so I want to keep those for last. And so on and so forth. So there are subtleties there. It's different. Again, it wasn't like, whoa. I would say maybe I'm a little more lukewarm about it because I wasn't blown away by it as I was blown away by the overall architecture, by such a simple game about maneuvering, about cat and mouse, about reading the opponent, about tricking the opponent. I would say maybe, again, I'm lukewarm because combat is good, but everything else is like, wow. The production looks very nice. There are times where I wish that the cities on the map were a little further from one another in certain areas of the map, because you are going to have maybe certain large groups of units, and sometimes it looks a little cluttered, like, are we sure it's this city, not the other one? Very minor points, because overall the flow, the back and forth, the interaction is absolutely fantastic. Honestly, I find this to be a phenomenal game. I had such a great time playing it. My daughter has been asking me almost daily to play it again, and we play several times, and it really can go in different ways. I would almost say the opening can be similar from game to game because the French player still has to threaten multiple locations. I guess you can really commit to one big bluff, or one big fake bluff as you're going towards your objectives, and that it. And the other player is still wondering, should I just go there, or is this a bluff, a double bluff, a triple bluff? Am I paranoid? What's happening in my mind? So there's still that that situation there. I would say the opening phases, unless somebody again is trying those extreme strategies, may not be all that different, but then the ramifications go in so many different ways that the game feels fresh after multiple plays. So 1815, Napoleon Returns. I loved it. I played it for now only with an 8-year-old, and I had as much fun as when I play war games with committed, experienced, seasoned wargaming human opponents. I can't wait until the crisis of 2020 is over and I can have as many wargame events as I want. Yeah, no, that never happens. As I can, due to my schedule, not just schedule and quarantine. I can't wait to also play with other people, but as of now, stuck in quarantine with my 8-year-old and the 10, but she doesn't play war games. Playing this game with my 8-year-old has been an absolute blast. I think it's a remarkable game. It feels so different from many other war games. It really puts the emphasis on certain things that's not always what it is about. There's a lot of tension as you see those units reduce and you're trying to spread damage so you don't get to where they lose cards. You have bluffing, you have tension, you have attrition, but not of the kind that turns the game into a repetitive slog. Attrition and maneuver and creative maneuvering and bluffing. Fantastic elements that are all put together in a very playable, very streamlined package that also happens to look great. So, high praise from me for 1815 Napoleon Returns.